season is all about. It's not about all the presents and all the Christmas things and the festivities and the parties and the presents, but really that really sums up what this season is really all about and why we do what we do as we celebrate this season. It's a great reminder for us to know that there's so much more to life than just these things. As great as these things are, as great as we have the opportunity to get together with family and friends, at the end of the day, if we don't have that, everything else is meaningless. So we're offered hope. We're offered light into our world. And I love that about Christmas. Well, hey, everyone, it's so good to see you. My name is David, and it's always such an honor for me to be a guest here. I love being here. The first thing that I encountered right when I walked in through those doors this morning was one of your greeters grabbed my hand and said, "You're David Choi, you're guest speaking today." I said, "Yes, let me pray for you, just pray for me." I'm like, this is amazing. I love this, because y'all will find out pretty soon that I need a lot of prayer. Well, hey, it's so good, again, like I said, to be here, and just the interactions that I've had with some of you, and just finding that such a blessing to know that, wherever we are in our life journey, there's always a place for us to feel connected, that common ground, and that is Jesus. Jesus really is the one who offers hope and life in this season, and gives us so much opportunities to celebrate, especially in this Advent Christmas season. I'm really excited for a couple of reasons, but I'm going to actually begin with one question for you. How many of you have people coming home for Christmas this year? Some of you, okay, good. How many of you are going home for Christmas this year? Okay, a few of you, okay, good. A couple of things here when it comes to coming home for Christmas. So I have my oldest daughter. This is a little bit of an interesting year for me because my oldest daughter is a first-year college student, and in a cool and a weird way, I get to say that I have a college student coming home for Christmas. And that just feels so weird for me to say because I never felt like I was that old guy. I feel like I'm thinking about I have to start thinking about AARP and retirement and all that stuff all of a sudden. With this child, this adult child coming home for Christmas. And in fact, actually, I should tell you, after being here a handful of times or so, now I feel like I trust you enough to show you a picture of my family. So that's my family there. My wife, Lydia, right next to me, without the glasses. We've been married for 20 years. And it's been such an amazing ride. A lot of ups and downs, but just so grateful to have someone like Lydia in my life. And then over here to your right is Miriam. She's my oldest. She's studying down in Southern California right now, coming home this week. And she's turning 19 this week. I cannot believe it. And then over on that side, the red is my second daughter, my middle child, Caitlin, and she is a middle child. Anyone else here is a middle child? Yeah. What is wrong with you people? And then our third and last one, that's Ben, and he's 11. And it's such an interesting thing because we obviously, clearly, there's a huge gap between the 19, 17-year-old and then our 11-year-old. And God must have had a plan because we didn't. And he just showed up one day. And we were very excited to have him in our life eventually. So this is kind of our family. And, there's just something about coming home, though. So I have my first daughter, Miriam, coming home. And there's this sense of anticipation, right? There's this sense of preparation and reigniting family traditions and all of these things that we're thinking about. In a lot of ways, coming home is associated a lot, usually, with joy and comfort. And it's okay, even if your home is not perfect, and no home is perfect. It's not a perfect place, but the interesting thing about home is that it's kind of a place where we can be ourselves. We don't have to try to put up the front. We don't have to try to pretend. We can just be who we truly are, for better or for worse. And I'll tell you, for us at our home, my wife and I, between my wife and I'm the one that usually travels more, so I'm at conferences and whatnot and different things, speaking at different places. But whenever I come home from a trip, when my kids were younger, they would make these welcome home banners. And they would make these banners just to help me feel a little bit more welcome, just to say how much they missed me when I got back home. But a few years back, it was my wife's turn, and we never really had that happen. But for the first time, my wife went away, and I stayed home with the 3 kids for 3 days. My goodness. At that time, the kids were 9, 7, and 1. And honestly, I thought it went pretty well. I thought I did a pretty good job. Everybody was alive. And so that's bar is low, but I made it happen. And but really, honestly, I felt like, okay, this wasn't too bad. I can do this, you know. I felt pretty proud of myself. Apparently, the kids thought otherwise. These ungrateful little kids, right? So they were actually longing and anticipating the return of Mom. And so they got really excited about counting down the days, counting down the hours, down to the minute, excited about when Mom would come back. And so they made her this extravagant banner, this poster for her, and this is what it looked like. It's a little picture that they made. And so, I mean, it's just really adorable. So if you look at the next picture here, this is my oldest, with Miriam, with her little ponytail, as cute as can be. She was 9 at the time. And then the second picture here is my second daughter, Caitlin. She's the one that actually drew this, right? She's the sassy one of the 3. This is her with her little pigtails and, you know, doing her thing. Obviously looking super cute. And then the third one, that's Ben. He was her baby. And they were, so they look all happy. And I thought, well, that's a sweet poster. Until I looked carefully at this one. What? Like, what is this all about? I had no idea what was going on. I said, why did you draw such an angry face, right? And here's what happens. Mom walks through the doors. They see this poster, and I see this poster. I'm like, what is going on? Then my middle child, Caitlin, runs to Mom. She's 7 years old. Wraps her arms around Mom like she's a little victim that needed to be rescued. Wraps around Mom and she says, Mom, I'm so glad you're home because Daddy ruined our week. But he was so mean to us all the time, right? I'm like, what? That is not even true. It's sort of true, maybe a little bit true, maybe a lot more than little. But I gotta be honest with you, it was not my proudest moment. I remember yelling a lot those 3 days, more than I usually do. But then here's the thing again about home, is that the home gives you an opportunity, whether you're the person waiting for someone to come home or you're the person coming home, there's something about home because it kind of gives you a sense that you can be kind of yourself with all your mistakes and still feel like you belong. And I know not everybody has that kind of luxury to come home and feel that way. And I know some of us grew up in homes that were a little bit harder than that. And we try to do our best for our kids, our next generation, to make them feel like this is a place, this is a safe place, this is a place where you belong. And so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, what does it feel like to come home? What does it feel like, not necessarily to the home, like with the address that you grew up in, but what does it feel like to be in a place that is safe? But then, conversely, what does it feel like to run from this place? Because there are actually people that are running away because they're pursuing something more, thinking that there's more out there, and they'll try to pursue something beyond what is at home. And so, in the spirit of this whole Christmas season, I want to speak a little bit about a young man and his journey of leaving home, only to discover that there is no journey more powerful than coming home. So I want to read to you from Luke chapter 15. This might be a passage that you are familiar with. I'm going to start with verse 11. This is often known to us as the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. And to me, this kind of felt like this isn't your typical Christmas passage, I will tell you that. But there's something about coming home and returning home and what God is calling us in this season to do. So I'm going to read, starting with verse 11, and this is how it reads. This is Jesus telling the story, and it says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living." I mean, if you think about this for a second, the audacity for this younger son to ask for his share of inheritance wasn't just rude. It wasn't just a rude thing. It was actually downright offensive, right? Because in that culture, in the ancient Near East culture, he was basically saying, "Dad, you are better off dead to me. Now give me my inheritance," right? And so he does this, and he sets off to a distant country, is what our passage says. A distant country far from home. But here's the truth of the matter. There's a couple things there are 4 observations that I want to make about this passage here today, really quickly today. The first observation is that the distant country is not measured in miles. And here's what I mean by that. See, it's not just about physically leaving home. It's not just about how far you get away from home. It's really about how our hearts have the tendency to drift away from home long before we set our foot out the door. And that was the case with this young man, was that even before he actually left home, his heart was already gone. He was ready, he was prepared. And even though he was physically there, his heart was not there. And it showed by his request, by his demand to get his inheritance while his father was still alive. And I don't know where most of us are here in this room. I don't know where we are in our hearts right now. I mean, you might be doing all the right things. You might be saying all the things that you need to be saying. But what we don't pay attention to often enough is where our heart is. See, before we leave for that distant country, whatever that is to us, our heart always leaves first. One of the things that I've learned to do myself, because I know I have the tendency, while I may be physically present, while I may be physically doing the right things and saying the right things, there are times where I know my heart is drifting. Sometimes I see it coming, a lot of times I don't. And so one of the things that I condition myself to do often is to pray that Psalm 139 prayer where it says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. And see if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me to the way everlasting." And I have to say this often. It's kind of like a health checkup, your annual health checkup with your doctor, to make sure your physical body is all in order and intact, right? We have to do the same thing for our hearts, but in fact, we have to actually do it way more often than we do with our physical bodies. Because our hearts are prone to wander, like it says in Scripture. Because our hearts have the tendency to want something more than what has been given to us. And so what will happen is, even before we physically step out of the place that we know we ought to be, our hearts start drifting, our hearts start wandering and leaving the place that we need to be. And I find myself saying this verse to myself often, asking God, where am I in relation to where you want me to be? You see, if we're not asking this question, we're going to catch ourselves, kind of like this young man here, in a distant country all of a sudden, wondering how in the world I got here. And so this passage continues with the younger son, verse 14, and says, "After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." And this is the second observation. That even when we get everything we wanted, we realize it's not what we truly needed. Even if we get everything we could ever want, eventually we realize it's not what we truly needed. Like, think about that for your own life. How many times, how many things do we want in our lives? Only to realize we would get it sometimes and realize, you know what? I didn't even really need this. And this is the realization that this the younger son realizes that everything that he had always wanted, he got. Right? He got away from his father's controls. Maybe that's what he felt like, and he needed to get away from that. He got all the money that he can ever want to spend. He was in charge of his own life. There were no rules, no regulations, no restrictions. He could do basically whatever he wanted, and he did. He went out partying and squandering everything that he had, only to realize that the things that he wanted was not the thing that he needed. There's something about that I realized even in my own life, that there's so many things that I want, so many things that I ask God for. God, I need this. God, I need that. And in the midst of all of that, what I realized is that everything that I want pales in comparison to what He has already given. And when we have these random thoughts of things that we need, I want this, I need that, I want just all these things that we want, the more we fixate our minds on these things, what eventually happens is that our hearts become less grateful. We become a little bit more selfish. We become a little bit more entitled. And we're not the grateful people that we know we ought to be. And that's the first thing that happens, that when we want all of these things that we don't need, what happens is that our hearts get hardened because we feel like, well, they have that, she has that, he has this, why don't I have that? And our hearts all of a sudden become hardened. And it becomes so hard to see all the things that God has gifted us and given to us. And we lose sight of that, and we become ungrateful people. And that's exactly what happened here in this passage, was that the son, for all these years, for however long the son might be, it's a parable, and so he's maybe thinking, you know what, it might have been like him wanting all of these things for years, just building up this sense of like not being given these things. And his heart had become hardened and ungrateful to the point where he just felt like, you know what, I'm taking all the money, all the family inheritance that's due me. When my father dies, I'm going to just take that and leave. And this is exactly what happens, is that when we become ungrateful, we start living a life that truly reflects that state of heart. And all of a sudden, this young man realizes what just happened. Verse 17, it says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, number one, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Number two, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And number three, make me like one of your hired servants. So he puts together this three-part speech, and so he got up and went to his father. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that up to this point in the story, there's nothing actually new to the listeners. The Pharisees, the rabbis, Jesus is telling this parable, this story, and they're like, you know what, I've heard this story, I know this story, because historians actually have discovered similar stories that have existed in Jewish tradition. See, long before Jesus told this story in Luke chapter 15, this story actually existed for the Jewish people. And so the Jewish rabbis, the Jewish teachers, the Pharisees, and all these people, they actually told this story before. And up to this point, they're like, there's nothing new here. What are you getting at, Jesus? But here's the difference. The way that this story ends, that was traditionally written for the Jewish people, the story that the rabbis and the teachers have taught, was this is how the story ends, is that basically one day the father saw his son returning. He waited with his arms crossed. The broken down son begged his father to take him back, but the father rejects him, saying, you are a disgrace, don't ever call me father again. That's how the original story ends. Isn't that interesting? In the ancient Near East culture, this version of the story actually isn't even cruel, it's actually expected. Like this is how they expected the father to respond, harshly, in kind of a cruel way because of what the son did. And so because of that version of the story, this young man is thinking through these three primary concerns as he's on his way home. The first concern is the crowd, the people, the townsmen, right? He's concerned about the crowd because in the Middle East, it's a collective culture, meaning your business is everybody's business. People talk, and people know all about what's going on because it's a very collective culture. Like everybody knows. That's why it's this very shame-based culture because everybody knows your junk, right? Everybody knows what's going on in somebody's home, right? Because they share. There's a collective culture to it, very different than our individualistic Western culture, right? Where we protect privacy. It's all about my business is my business, your business is yours. We kind of stay within our lanes. In that collective culture, like stories and people's lives were so enmeshed that this young man, as he's coming back to think, he knows, as he's on his way, journey back home, he knows that everybody in the town knows about him. He knows he's going to be humiliated by the people as he comes back. He knows he's going to be taunted and mocked and even beaten. But even still, he knows he still has to come home. That's how desperate things have gotten. His second concern is the older brother. Now he knows he has to live with the scrutiny of his older brother, looking down at him and saying, "Man, you're such a failure. You failed. You messed up royally, dude. I cannot believe you. You will never measure up to me." Like, how many of us have older siblings like that, right? And you're kind of like living in that shadow of the older brother. Now it's like even a darker shadow, knowing that, well, he was right. I truly did mess up, right? And so he knows he has to live that for the rest of his life. But even still, he is so desperate, he's willing to put up with all that. The third one is a little bit more difficult for him because it's the father. He's concerned about his father's reaction because he's expecting his father to scold him, to reject him, definitely beat him. Just like this parable, the original version of the parable, like he is expecting all of these things, even to the point of death. I don't know if you knew this, but in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18, it says that a father could have a rebellious son stoned to death. So he's coming home even with that. He's coming home knowing that his fate is in the hands of his father, depending on how he's going to respond. He'll most likely, he will definitely scold him. He will definitely beat him. He could even have him stoned to death. But that's how desperate this young man got. He thought, you know what, even if it means death, I'm going to try. I'm going to try to come home. So knowing that this will be his likely destiny, out of desperation, he prepares this three-part speech, hoping against hope that he would somehow miraculously find a reason to be spared by his father. And so he prepares this speech and he starts going home. But while he was a long way off, and this is kind of the climax of the story, this is where the entire story of this lost son is presented in a different way by Jesus than any other of the Jewish teachers. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Now, so this is not how the Jewish leaders and the teachers of the law remember the story. They're like, what is he doing? This is not how the story goes. He's telling the story all wrong, right? And so they're getting like a little bit disturbed because the story of the version of the story that they know is being completely skewed to the opposite, 180-degree different than what they've known. And so this is our third observation. The third observation is that we can never out-sin God's grace. No matter what we do. No matter how far our hearts drift. whether physically or just within our hearts, no matter how far we drift, we can never, ever out-sin God's grace. I don't know about you, but that's some of the greatest things I've ever. Because there are many things that I have physically done, many things I have thought in my head that it just felt so unforgivable, and yet to God there is nothing too powerful for His grace. And so while He was a far way off, He saw him. This is grace. This is grace. God knows sometimes we don't have it in us to come to Him. Because He knows sometimes we don't have it in our hearts to be able to come back home because we feel so filthy, we feel so far, we feel so embarrassed and so ashamed of what we had done. There is no way. But the grace in this story is that the Father sees him while he is far off. And God knows even we might not have what it takes to come back to Him. So He comes to us. He meets us where we are. He meets us in the state. He doesn't wait for the son to get his act together. He doesn't wait for him to finally get a job and put his foot back and be able to kind of, restore some of the finances that he lost. He doesn't expect us to be able to, put our lives back together and fix ourselves and get our lives a little bit more better than what it was before, better than what it is right now, for God to be able to accept us. That's not what He waits for. Instead, God doesn't wait for us to get our acts together. He comes out looking for the Son, looking for each and every one of us. He meets us where we are. And at this point in the story, everyone is expecting rejection and scorn and even stoning him to death, like the Deuteronomy 21 passage. But the Father, what does He do? Does He grab a staff? A whip? A stone? No. He doesn't grab any of those things. See, these weren't things that should have been done. These were things that had to be done. Because it was the law. It was the law of the Old Testament, was that it had to be done. If your child rebels in this way, you have to discipline him in a harsh way. So it was something that had to be done. And so while everyone is expecting punishment and rejection, they're expecting Deuteronomy 21 to happen. This kid's about to get stoned to death, even possibly. The Father instead felt compassion. The pastor said the Father was deeply moved. And the Greek word for this it describes the inward parts. It's the inner, the gut, the parts that are deep within us. The pain that only a parent in anguish could know. And that's what the Father feels towards the Son. But not only that, the Father runs to the Son. Like He ran. And here's the thing. Here in the U.S., if you're 70 and you can run, it's called impressive. Back in those days, if you're 70 and you can run, it's called embarrassing. It's called awkward. Because a man of that age and of that stature should not be running. Because in order to run, remember they wore like longer robes? That meant they had to lift up the hem of their robe, exposing their feet, their ankles, their undergarments. And it was a very undignified picture of an older man of such stature. And yet he starts running. Not only to embrace his son, but also because he knows what his son will face if he doesn't get to him first. He knows that townspeople will beat him. He knows if the older brother gets to him, he's going to feel the extent of the punishment. And so the Father runs, again, not only to embrace him, but also to protect him from everyone else. The Father hugs him, and He kisses him, and He holds him tight. And by this act, the Father is taking off the shame of His Son on Himself. This is a beautiful picture of Jesus actually foreshadowing what He is about to do on the cross. By embracing the filth of His Son, He's taking on the filth of His Son onto Himself. And Jesus foreshadowing what will happen on the cross. See? Now, whatever it was that the crowd or the older brother, whatever they wanted to do to the younger brother, now they have to do to the father. The father is now going to be taking the punishment. Again, it's a picture of what Jesus did for us on the cross. There's nothing that he did. If anything, he was the righteous one, and he could have pointed to all the sinners out there. And instead of doing that, he comes and embraces. And that's what he does for you. And that's why his life, celebrating the birth of his life, is so important to us. Because it's not just the birth of a king, it's the birth of one who would save us. Who would wrap his arms around us despite all the filth, despite all the things that were supposed to happen to us. God in his mercy sends Jesus to wrap his arm around us so that we don't feel the wrath of what is to come. This is exactly what the grace and mercy of God is. He has hidden our sin, all of our sins, our shame, our guilt, all of our regrets, all the things that you're thinking about, all the things that we feel like we have fallen short of, all of these things. We realize God embraces with His grace. There's nothing that we can do to absent God's grace. So here's the fourth and final observation about this passage. God gives us His best even when we are in our worst. God gives us His best even in our very worst. This story takes a really crazy turn because now this passage continues. It says, "But the father said to his servants, 'Quick,' after embracing him, says, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him.'" Now, here's the crazy thing about the best robe, right? He doesn't say just bring a new robe. He doesn't say bring a clean robe. He doesn't say bring a good one. He doesn't say bring a comfortable one. He says bring the best robe. Why is this crazy? Because the best robe is the Father's robe. He's saying, put my robe around him. God, the Father, covers our failures with His robe of righteousness. That's exactly what's happening here. To cover the shame, to cover all the failures and his young man's body just falling apart, all the filth and all the dirt. Remember, he was in the pig pen feeding pigs, and just remember all that filth. But He covers us so that none of our shame will be exposed. Instead, what people will see when they see us is that robe of righteousness that wraps around us. And then He says, put a ring on his finger. And it's not just a fancy looking ring, but this ring is actually really symbolic. It's the signet ring. It's the ring that the Father uses actually to seal all of His official documents. And here's why this is symbolic, because the Father is basically restoring trust back onto the Son. The son that squandered 1/3 of the family wealth is now given the authority to manage the rest of the family's wealth. Isn't that amazing? Like, He gives us authority. He gives him the authority to say, you know what? I forgive you. To show you that I truly forgive you. To really show you that I really mean what I'm saying. I'm giving you the signet ring. You now possess the power, the authority to manage all the family finances. And the sandals on his feet, and basically the slaves were barefoot, family had sandals, so it's basically saying, you know what, you're not a slave, you're not going to come here as a slave, no, you're going to come here as my son, as family. And so He put sandals on his feet. It says, bring the fattened calf and killed it, let's have a feast and celebrate, which was actually reserved for special guests, people with, these were important visitors that would come. The highest honor that you can provide for a guest in the Middle East is to butcher a calf. That's exactly what the Father does. And it says, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. God gives us His best, even in our worst moments of life. And this is what I want to close us with here today. That in this Advent, this Christmas season, I wonder if there's more to it than just coming home for Christmas. I wonder how many of us need to come home to Jesus. See, just because we show up here on the weekends, just because we're considered leaders in the church, just because we serve in the church, we do good things, just because we're pastors, see, none of those things make us immune from setting off to a distant country. And so here's my question for every one of us here today. The question is, where are you? Where are you? Wherever you are, I know one thing is for certain. That Father wants you home for Christmas. There is absolutely nothing you can do to make yourself not welcome in His home. Would you just pray with me? God, we just want to thank you, Lord, for your extravagant love on us. God, in some ways, in one way or another, God, I know there's so many of us, God, that can relate to this story. And it's not even really about physically squandering off our lives, God, but maybe somehow deep down inside of our hearts, God, we have left home. Maybe in our hearts we started drifting and started pursuing the things that we wanted. Leaving the comfort and the safety of the home, God, that you provide for us. Feeling like we didn't need your grace, feeling like we didn't need your love or your mercy because there's some things that I can actually do on my own, that I can prove for myself. Maybe our hearts have wandered a little bit. Maybe we did some things, God, that, I don't know, God, that just made us feel a little bit more distant from you. But in this season, God, we're reminded, God, of your Son, who left home so that we can come home. Thank you for sending your Son into this world. Thank you that he was humble enough to make himself vulnerable and frail, just like any one of us, God. To expose himself in such a way, God, so that he can say, I know what you went through. I know what you felt. And as a way, God, you sent him as a messenger to bring us home, to allow him to speak into our heart, to say, it's time to come home. Thank you for the life of Jesus. The life, the death, the resurrection, God, and what all that means to us. And so, God, this season, God, we're so grateful. It's not just about the warm, fuzzy feelings of this Christmas season, God, but it's truly about the life that you've given to us because of your Son, Jesus. So we say thank you, thank you, thank you, again and again. In this season, God, we turn our hearts to you, and we want to draw ourselves closer to you. In Jesus' name we pray.